Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. We have the same picture of our diagram. What's our model that we've been looking at of this nephron? Let's trace where we've been and figure out where we're going. So we have, of course, our starting point, which is our Bowman's capsule. This is where filtration occurs. So all that liquid, electrolytes, nutrients, and so forth initially gets pushed out of the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule, and from there it moves into our proximal convoluted tubule, which we can abbreviate PCT. So the fluid moves through proximal convoluted tubule. That's where reabsorption really takes place, meaning about 67% of the water that was filtered out goes back into the bloodstream. 99.9% of nutrients gets conserved. It gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. We get quite a few electrolytes moving in as well. From there, we moved into the descending limb of the loop of Henle. And notice here in the descending limb, I'm using a blue color to indicate that this is the section where you continue obligatory water reabsorption. So here we see like 15% of the water still in that filtrate gets reabsorbed back. And then we have movement of the fluid up the ascending limb, and here we're going to see in the ascending limb that we're going to reabsorb electrolytes, so sodium, chloride, and potassium. And by the time we make it to the distal convoluted tubule, which is our topic for today, so let me highlight the distal convoluted tubule. By the time we make it to the distal convoluted tubule, 80% of the water that was initially filtered out has been reabsorbed through what is called obligatory water reabsorption. Now notice that the distal convoluted tubule is twisty-turny, just like the proximal convoluted tubule is twisty-turny. And so this term convoluted in my definition, in my dictionary, is defined as twisty-turny. Notice that the distal convoluted tubule twists all the way back up around by Bowman's capsule, so that we're seeing it up there close to where the afferent arteriole enters and the efferent arteriole exits. If we actually go back to our diagram where we looked at the Bowman's capsule super up close, notice, remember, we have here the distal convoluted tubule that's been cut up here close and in between the afferent and the efferent arterioles. Notice too that we're seeing that the distal convoluted tubule is lined with our old friend simple cuboidal epithelium, and notice that there's no microvilli, so we don't have another brush border. So again, as we're looking at our distal convoluted tubule, we can abbreviate it if we want, DCT. We're seeing it here on the distal end of the loop of Henle. So we're pretty far away from that initial filtration. Of course, we're calling it tubular fluid here. We're seeing it lined with the simple cuboidal epithelium. And the distal convoluted tubule, we'll see, is actually the most twisted. So the most convoluted, and we'll see too that it's actually going to be shorter than the PCT. And again, you know, in our diagram of our simple cuboidal epithelium or in our model, there were no microvilli. So you might see a few, but it's way less than what we had in the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, what we'll see happening in the distal convoluted tubule, we'll see what's described as facultative. water reabsorption. And so what that means is, depending on your body conditions, you might have some additional water that's reabsorbed. When we talk about like, well, how much water reabsorption varies, we'll see that we are only going to be absorbing here like 10 to 15% of the water from that original filtrate. So we've already reabsorbed 80%, and so then we can be flexible with the remaining 10 to 15%. So when we're seeing the difference between like a concentrated and a dilute urine, this is the level of difference that we're seeing. So there's going to be a couple of different hormones that we're going to see involved here controlling the distal convoluted tubule, and one major one is ADH. And this is an old friend. We've talked about ADH as antidiuretic hormone. We have another name called vasopressin. I feel like perhaps I misspelled it, but I did not. And when we talk about ADH as vasopressin, we're going to see that it's going to have two major things that it can do. But when we talk about it in terms of the distal convoluted tubule, what we'll see is it will increase what are called aquaporin channels, which is going to increase water reabsorption. So water is a very small but polar molecule. Since it's so small, it actually will fit through phospholipid bilayers, even though the water is polar and the phospholipid bilayer is a lipid layer and is nonpolar. So what we'll see is that difference in polarity will kind of slow down the movement of water. In the case of the nephron, when we're talking about all of this like extensive water reabsorption, we have special channels in the cells called aquaporin, and those aquaporin channels are specific for water. So it's a special water doorway in a sense. The cells of the distal convoluted tubule, and we'll see also collecting duct, they kind of have these aquaporin channels at the ready in the cell, but not automatically part of the cell membrane. Under the influence of antidiuretic hormone, what we'll see happening is those aquaporin channels get pushed into the cell membrane. So now you have a whole bunch of water channels. So the water then is able to very easily leave the distal convoluted tubule, move into the bloodstream, and gets reabsorbed. So when ADH is present, then you have a lot of water reabsorption. If you don't have ADH present, those vasopressin, if you don't have ADH present, then the aquaporin channels, move out of the cell membrane and you don't have those big water channels. We'll also see here at the distal convoluted tubule aldosterone. Aldosterone is another old friend, and we've seen very often that ADH and aldosterone are released together. So when we have the release of our old friend aldosterone, what we get is an increase in sodium ion reabsorption. And we also are going to turn on sodium potassium exchange pumps. And when we turn on sodium potassium exchange pumps, the sodium is reabsorbed. So it's going from the nephron back into the bloodstream, and the potassium is secreted out. So the potassium actually is exchanged. It enters the nephron, it enters the distal convoluted tubule, and it becomes part of the urine. So we can see a connection, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, in our regulation of potassium levels and our aldosterone levels. So that'll be a piece of information that we come back to. The other hormone that we can see influencing here are DCT is another old friend, which is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is, of course, being produced by the parathyroid gland. And we talked about it when we talked about calcium regulation, and we see it's going to be actually increasing calcium ion reabsorption. And then we also see that the PTH is going to trigger the cells to release calcitriol, which we know is the active version of our vitamin D3. So we've talked about that as talking to the small intestine and being involved in absorption of calcium from our diet. Okay, up next, we have that collecting duct. So please stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.